I think sets up this chapter pretty well, because what we're going to try to do in this chapter is apply a lot of those concepts that were brought up in chapter 1. So we're going to be looking at different levels of analysis for one particular kind of behavior, and this behavior is going to be bird song production. And really we're going to be focusing on song learning in birds as we move through. So there's a way in which the chapter can kind of be broken up by these 4 major levels of analysis. So we're going to start with discussion of how, of the genetic and developmental basis of songs and song learning in birds. We're going to be looking at the neural basis of song learning. We're going to be looking at evolutionary history, and we're going to be looking at the adaptive value of the thing, and looking at experiments that have been done to try to assess and understand all of these different, understand song and song learning at all these different levels. So here's a kind of a case in point, and at least within the realm of trying to study bird song and bird song learning, the white-crowned sparrow has become kind of the guinea pig and has become a really important model, in part just because it happens to be a pretty common songbird, at least in the West, and this is where a lot of the major researchers have focused their efforts. But these are just, you know, normal little, normal-looking sparrow. They're kind of neat in that they have this little white crown, these black and white sort of zebra stripes on their heads. And one of the interesting things about these guys, though, is that if you listen to white-crowned sparrows in different parts of the country, even relatively close by parts of the country. So, for example, here's San Francisco Bay. And so what they're trying to depict here are the songs that are produced by white-crowned sparrows in San Francisco Bay. So here they are at Berkeley. This is where one of the major researchers was housed. But then just a little bit north up in Marin, and a little bit south down at Sunset Beach, you see differences, or you hear differences in terms of the calls that are produced by these animals. So these things are what are referred to as spectrograms. Sometimes you hear them sonograms as well. What they're doing is they're depicting frequency on the y-axis here. So this is basically the pitch. So if you have a really high pitch, it'll show up higher on this graph, and then as you go to a lower pitch and lower pitch and lower pitch, it'll go lower and lower and lower on this graph. Okay? And then this is just time. So you can take any sound that you can record with a microphone, and you can feed it into computer software that can interpret that into a spectrogram. That software we were using last week, actually, the little recording software, Boris, actually has the ability to take any video clip that you feed into it, and it can create a spectrogram on its own, which I just sort of discovered as we were playing around with this, but it's a really nice little feature of the program. The nice thing about spectrograms is that rather than having to listen over and over and over again to try to hear, what's different between two different songs, you can just visually look at a sound and try to understand how the sound is depicted. So for our purposes, really, you can just sort of know that when there are different patterns, really what you're looking at, there are differences in the sound that you would hear. And you can kind of see that in this group from Marin, they have a song where there's sort of like a long band. This would be sort of a whistle sound, sort of one pitch. And then there'd be kind of a trill where you've got a bunch of sort of quickly oscillating sorts of sounds over a short period of time. In Berkeley, in San Francisco Bay, on the other hand, you kind of have two whistles and then this trill. All right, so there's sort of a little bit of a difference there in terms of what you will usually hear. Maybe there's some evidence of two whistles there, but it's not as dramatic as what we're seeing here. Here, maybe even there's like 4. And then down in Sunset Beach, you got 2 whistles there as well, but there's a little bit more of a pronounced, you can see this, a little bit more of a pronounced pitch difference. It's kind of subtle on this graph, but you're starting low, and then the next one is a little bit higher. And so we're seeing pretty consistent differences in different populations of these white crowns. I have a couple videos I'll play for you real quick. I don't have them from these different populations around San Francisco Bay, but I do have some that are just to give you a feel for what these sounds sound like. Whoops. All right, so first thing I'm going to play for you is a white-crowned sparrow from Washington State. just so you can kind of hear what it sounds like. I think this will work. Yeah. Play again, dude. So D, 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 D. That's what I'm hearing, right? D, 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 D. I'll let him do it one more time. All right, so that's Washington State. Here's one from Alaska. So this is quite a bit further away, but it's the same species. That's not D, 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 D. It's, do it again. Pretty different, right? If you listen to lots and lots of birdsong and you listen to lots and lots of white-crowned sparrows, you do see certainly they vary a fair bit, but they're probably more similar to each other than they are to some unrelated species. So here's a golden-crowned sparrow, for example. Let's let him play. So that's a totally different sort of a song, right? I mean, it's dee 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 dee, and so it's not kind of a whistle and then some trill in maybe a 4-unit sequence like I hear with the white crowns. But nevertheless, it gives you a feel for what we might be dealing with here with these white crowns, and that they do differ in substantial ways, even within a relatively short distance apart from one another. So I think we reasonably could ask then, well, why in the world are they doing that? Could we be looking at something where we've got genetic differences between these different populations? That's not an unreasonable thing, and there could be genes that drive differences in the bird song. There are definitely cases of that in different species of birds where, where there are genetic differences that drive them to sing in different ways. Or we could ask, do we have an example of song learning where they're learning local dialects? So these are two different kinds of, or two different explanations for a question. I mean, would you say, if we're asking, if this question is, what is causing these differences in birdsong, and our two explanations are that one is it could be driven by differences in genes, another is it could be driven by differences in learning and experience. Would you say those are proximate or ultimate explanations, based on what we talked about last time? The other word for ultimate is evolutionary. What do you think? Yeah. We don't really know, right? I mean, that's that could be part of the thing.
They stay in one spot, like these populations, that it's supposed to be ultimate. If they move and then they change their songs, it can be possible.
Other thoughts? Yeah, I think so. Other thoughts? What do you think? Let's figure out a way to get you guys a little bit more interactive. I don't know how. I mean, does everybody, maybe we can have a vote. So who thinks that these are ultimate explanations? That's what you just said, though, right? Who thinks that they are proximate explanations? A couple people. So why do you think it's proximate? If you disagree, what do you think? You've already been talking, so I'm not going to give you, but like Ava, what do you think?
I think proximate just because, like, song learning doesn't, it's based on like what you hear and not like something that's been evolving over time.
So it's something that the individual is experiencing, you're saying. Allie? Yeah, that's all right. I could sort of pick up on it. Yeah, so I think my view on this is I feel like specifically in this, like the way I'm kind of phrasing this, my attempt to phrase this, is if I'm asking what is causing these birds to sing like this, and these birds to sing like this, and these birds to sing like this, and I'm saying, well, A, it could be that they differ in their genes, or B, it could be they differ in their experiences, basically, right? That's really kind of focusing on this mechanism of what's going on within a given bird that's causing it to produce in this manner, to produce song in this manner. So I think the gene one maybe is the most straightforward. If I'm saying that the reason that these guys sound different from these guys is that these guys have different genes than these guys, that's a genetic mechanism there. So that's more of a proximate level explanation. Similarly, I mean, it's kind of the same thing if I'm saying that the reason these guys differ from these guys is that these guys have different experiences, and so they learn different things than these guys. Then that's also kind of like what's going on with the life within the life of the animal. Certainly these things can be shaped by selection. So, the fact that if it turns out that these guys do differ in their genes, it could be because selection has driven them to be different in their genes. But that's not directly what we're asking here. We're not saying like what's the adaptive value? What are the advantages of singing this way versus this way? That would be more of an adaptive value question, an ultimate question. We're not really asking even what's the evolutionary history, although I think that's kind of what you were getting at with your thing about moving around and how is this inherited. But here we're really sort of focusing on just like immediately, why do these birds sound different from these birds from these birds? I didn't mean to get caught up on that. I'm actually more interested in this question. So how do you think we could test these explanations? So if we think it's possible that the reason these guys sound different from these guys is that they differ in genes, how could we test that? What are some ways? There's different ways. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, well, but it is a feasible thing now. That's kind of cool. So you could get sequences on them and look for genetic differences. You could check to see, I guess if anything, maybe you can't find the genes. It might be hard to find the genes that control bird song right away. But at least you could check to see, are they genetically isolated groups? That would be a feasible thing. And even your book actually has a whole figure I wasn't even going to show you that does try to do that and assess whether or not these white crowns are genetically isolated populations. If they're genetically isolated, then the genetic hypothesis starts to get feasible. Because that would imply that they're not moving around and they could have different sets of genes in the different groups. Other ideas for how you could test between like a genetic basis versus learning idea? Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, so you do these, I mean, you could do it in lab. You could also just do like transplant experiments where you just sort of steal some eggs from up here and swap them from some eggs down here and then do that kind of thing. But the idea is you're changing the environment around the animal, right? So if you do this where you take some eggs and you play them a song that is from a different group, and if the song learning hypothesis is correct, then what would we expect to find? So if song learning hypothesis is true, you take some eggs, you put them in a different environment, play them a different song, what song should they start producing as adults? What do you think? Yeah. Yeah, right? So if they should start singing the song that you played to them, or the song that, if you take Marin eggs and move them to Sunset Beach and have them reared by Sunset Beach parents, they should start producing Sunset Beach song if song is something that's learned. On the other hand, if it's genetic differences that are behind this, then if you took Marin eggs and moved them to Sunset Beach and had the same experiment, we would predict in that case that they should still sound like Marin birds if it's genetic differences that are driving the differences in song, right? So this is another experiment that you can do. So you can look for geographic isolation. You can try to do these transplant experiments. These are all possibilities. Generally speaking, it seems as though, at least in the white crowns, that they really do seem to learn. So They don't seem to be particularly genetically isolated. There are some little subset of populations, and again, there's a whole figure in your book if you want to investigate that. But when you do these kinds of transplant experiments, or you start to manipulate the environment, the rearing environment, the acoustic environment around the chicks, you do get differences in terms of the songs that they produce. So, for example, we do find that if you take chicks and you rear them in an environment without songs at all, they will try to produce songs. So they have sort of some kind of an innate drive to produce song, but it won't sound anything like what it should sound like. It'll just sound like a bunch of random, syllables if you don't ever let them hear a song as a chick. So they do seem to need to hear it at one point. Similarly, if you deafen a bird, they also won't be able to produce a normal adult song, and they've done this experiment in multiple ways. So you can deafen a chick so that it never even really hears the song. That ends up being, the same sort of result as these guys that were reared without hearing songs at all. Another experiment is that they let them hear the songs as chicks, but the way these guys work is they hear songs for a while, and then but they don't immediately start to copy them. And so you can sort of let them hear the songs during that period, but then once they start to produce songs, if you deafen them at that point, then they also won't be able to produce a normal song because they seem to need to hear what they're actually singing, probably not surprisingly. So it does seem that, based on a lot of different experiments, that the chicks actually seem to learn song during what's referred to as a sensitive period. So this is a graph that kind of depicts this over here. So here you've got day of development. And so what will happen is during days about 10 to 50, white-crowned sparrow chicks have this really sort of unique sensitive period where this is when they are sort of laying down memories of the song. And so they're listening to the birds around them. Usually it's going to be their parents that are singing and calling nearby. And they are basically laying down, apparently, memories of this thing. They're not actually singing at this time, though. Because what happens is, once this period ends, they'll go basically another 100 days before they start to make any kind of vocalization. So months go by. But then, even if you put them in an environment where they never hear a song again, so they hear the songs during days 10 to 50, but then you put them in a sound-isolated chamber, they never hear another song again, at about day 150, they start to try to sing. They undergo this sort of plastic song period where things don't quite sound right, but they're like practicing. It's almost like practicing on an instrument or something. And then by about day 100, they will produce a nice full song. Again, even if they haven't heard that song since days 10 to 50. So they seem to lay down those memories during that sensitive period. They start singing at day 150, and by the time they get to about day 200, their song has crystallized into sort of this mature form. And this seems to be the typical course of action. Here's a sonogram showing like a typical male father's song. This is going back to these deafening experiments, but this is what son 1 would produce after hearing his father. And you can see it's a pretty close match. I mean, again, without really interpreting what each of these little sounds would exactly sound like, we can at least sort of, just recognize that there's basically similar kinds of patterns at each step along the way here. This would be a deafened son. So this would be a son that was not able to hear the song and wasn't able to, or at least wasn't able to hear himself singing it. And you can see he's making some noise, but it doesn't really look or sound anything like what his father's would have looked like. So this is nice evidence for this this song learning hypothesis. It does seem as though they do learn songs, at least within the white crowns. And it turns out within most of these passerine birds, these animals do learn songs and sometimes can learn multiple songs, depending on the species. We'll talk about song sparrows later that develop this whole repertoire where they're learning song after song after song after song, and they actually use these songs in little vocal sparrings and such. And so it's important that they be able to learn numerous different kinds of songs that are specific to the environment that they're in. So that's the development of the thing. What about the neural basis of songs and song production and song learning? So how is it that they're actually doing it? What's the neural machinery that's behind it? So that's going to be sort of our next topic here. like most complex behaviors, if you look within the brain of the animal and you start to do electrical recordings or you start to stain and track patterns of neurons, what we find is that birdsong is controlled by nuclei that exist around the brain. Nuclei is a specific term, it's a nervous system term. In the context of the nervous system and study of nervous system, nucleus means sort of a collection of neurons. It's almost like a ganglion that's existing inside the central nervous system. So sometimes we talk about ganglia existing outside the central nervous system, or little collections of gray matter that exist outside. A nucleus is basically a collection of gray matter that's somewhere inside the brain. So we have all kinds of nuclei as well. So if you look in our medulla, for example, in the base of our brain, we have nuclei that control things like swallowing and coughing and heart rate regulation and these kinds of things. And this is effectively what we're dealing with here. We have little nuclei that seem to have different discrete tasks. And they have horrible names, and your book even makes fun of their names, which is great. But this just gives you sort of a feel for some of the mechanisms which people have uncovered by doing experiments over time to study how these things work. Like I said, some of these experiments are just a matter of sticking electrodes into bird brains and recording what's happening. A lot of these experiments are actually ablation experiments, where if you suspect that a particular area of the brain does a thing, it's not maybe the most pleasant experiment in the world, but it is an experiment that works. If you ablate that area of the brain, so you basically go in there with a cauterizing gun and you destroy that area of the brain by burning it away, and then see what happens and what the bird is still capable of doing, that's a nice test to see the importance of that particular structure. From that, at least in terms of producing song, this seems to be the way it works. There's this whole area up here that's called the higher vocal center, the HVC. And it sends signals via this other area, the NCM, down to this area. It's called the robust nucleus of the archopallidum, which is sort of a long, drawn-out name. But this structure then, in turn, this is like part of the basal ganglia, I think. This structure, in turn, sends signals down to the hypoglossal nucleus, which is kind of in their, what would be their medulla. And this then, in turn, relays signals to their syrinx. And the syrinx is kind of like the larynx of a bird. This is their song production structure. And so, probably not surprisingly, if we think this is kind of like the higher vocal center, if we think this is where a lot of the main plans for vocalizations come from, and that the archopallium over here is kind of in charge of designing those motor signals and sending them down to these circuits, which then send them to the actual muscles that control the syrinx. If you destroy elements along the way, this obliterates the ability of this animal to actually vocalize. So for example, if you ablate the archopallium in this area, then this bird will no longer be able to produce song. It just won't be able to send the motor signals down to its muscles, which would be in charge of modulating the syrinx and causing the changes in those muscles that are required to produce the exact song of the bird. So these structures seem to be important in the production mechanism, and we see an impact if we look at animals that sing a lot versus animals that don't sing as much. We see differences in terms of the size of these different nuclei. So for example, this is a depiction of this robust nucleus of the archopallium, the RA structure. This is in males, and this is in females. And what they're doing here is they're actually standing, I think they're standing for a particular gene that tends to be expressed very frequently. It's called the Zenk gene. That's expressed frequently in these nuclei. And what you can see is that this gene is expressing a lot of protein in the RA structure. And males have this fairly large structure producing that gene, whereas females have a much smaller structure producing that gene. And that maps to, in this particular species, I can't remember what this was, some kind of sparrow, I think, where the males produce a lot more vocalizations than females. Females certainly have one, they do vocalize, but they're not producing long, drawn-out, dramatic songs like the males are, presumably because that the males are using those either in male-male competitions or to attract females. And in this particular species, at least, it results in a pretty dramatic difference in the size of these structures. So we have a decent idea of what is the mechanism that underlies the production of the song. That doesn't tell us how they learn the song, though. But there are some other structures that are kind of identified here, and these structures seem to be involved in actually learning of songs. So how does the song learning system work? Again, a lot of these experiments are based on ablation experiments or studying, if they're not ablating, in modern day systems, they can basically, I mean, for lack of better descriptors, they basically can use chemicals to turn on and turn off signals, so you can send neurotransmitters in to inhibit or not certain nuclei. And here's what we found about the song learning system. The HVC, again, is involved. And so I think the thought would be that when the bird is hearing a song, its HVC would be receiving auditory input, and then it will relay that to some other centers along the way. So for example, some of the signals that are apparently coming through the HVC, through auditory circuits, are relayed over to this other structure that's called the anterior nidopallium, or the L-man. You'll note that there are very few letters in here that are also in here. So I don't know where these abbreviations came from, but this is what they do. But that structure then seems to relay them to this other structure called area X, which then also can send signals down here. And there are some loops whereby L-man and area X can communicate with the RA structure. And so you are able to get your song production machinery talking to some of your song learning and memory circuit creation machinery that's over here. We do find that in ablation experiments, if you ablate this L-man structure, that'll have substantial consequences on the ability of the animal to learn song, at least temporarily. A lot of the newer work, the original work, I will just say, used to indicate that this thing was absolutely necessary for bird learning. There's been subsequent work that's been done on this even in the past 5 years, so your book has kind of changed its tone in this current edition, that indicates that that this structure is basically maybe not absolutely necessary, but certainly seems to be involved somehow in the learning of the song. It used to be thought if you ablated it, the animal couldn't learn song at all. You do see differences in the size of these specific structures as well that correspond to the degree to which these animals need to learn. So for example, males tend to have larger HVC sizes. When males learn songs, then females are able to produce. You can also go into the neurons themselves and actually take recordings. And this is, I think, a really cool thing. It's kind of getting more into like a neuroscience class than what we're going to be focusing on in our class, as much as I'd like to. So if you want to do more on this, you can take neuroscience. We don't do it in birds, but we talk about it in people. Where if you look at some of the neurons that are present within the HVC or the L-man or area X, and in particular this experiment was on HVC neurons, we see that some are really, really specialized. So what this figure is showing is from an experiment where they're basically recording from one particular neuron. And the recording from that one particular neuron is shown all throughout here. Okay, so this is the same neuron that they're recording from. And anytime you see a little spike, that means that that neuron is firing an action potential. So if you sort of go over time, what you're seeing is that there's kind of not a lot going on here. It's firing action potentials now and then. But then in this period over here, it starts to go crazy and fires lots and lots of action potentials for a discrete period of time. And then it kind of settles down again. And what's happening here is that this neuron seems to be responding to different auditory inputs. In this first frame over here, they're playing song type A to it. So these are all from the same species. I think this is a swamp sparrow. These are all from the same species, but they're different songs that these animals are able to produce. If you play song A to it, the neuron kind of doesn't really care. It doesn't seem to respond very much. If you play song B to it, though, it starts to go nuts. This neuron starts firing like crazy within the brain of this animal. If you then play song C to it, it basically stops responding again. So we have this neuron, this individual neuron that it's recording from, somewhere here in the HVC, that is very, very responsive to this particular song type. And you can kind of see this is not just like a straight up sort of like an auditory neuron, because like this song, I mean, it's different from this one, but it's still very similar. It's got a similar kind of a cadence to it. It's got similar numbers of syllables. The frequency range is roughly the same. It's just slightly different patterns of sort of these up slurs and down slurs instead of these more vertical, sort of punctuated notes. But that's enough to cause this neuron to start firing like crazy. So we've got a neuron now that's kind of really specific to type B. And the cool thing is, if you take your electrode out and you poke another neuron that's not too far away, you can find neurons that are very specific to type C, but they won't respond to song type B or song type A. You can find other neurons in the same general area of the brain that are very specific and responsive to song type A, but not B or C. So you kind of have like these neurons that are, they're pretty far downstream apparently in the auditory processing system, but they are capable of being particularly responsive to one song or another. And so these are, a way you can think of this is that these guys are involved in song recognition. And so when neuron B is firing, that's going to tell other parts of its brain, hey, right now I'm hearing song B. And that might then be used to influence the behavior of other neurons that allow for appropriate responses when song B occurs. Does that make sense? Questions on how that works? It's pretty neat. There's a lot of similar work that's done on humans. So they'll stick you in a machine they can stick you in an MRI machine or an fMRI, I think these are, that has really nice fine resolution. And then what they will do is they will they may present to you different kinds of pictures. And they may look to see what areas of your brain light up when they show you pictures of people's faces versus pictures of fruit, right? A lot of, fruit and faces have a lot of similar features. They're all kind of round circular objects. But certainly humans put a lot of attention, and we have a lot of brain power that's sort of dedicated to processing faces. We're trying to recognize people. We're trying to interpret facial expressions so that we can better understand communication and what's going on there. Fruit might trigger another set of circuits for hunger or for foraging kinds of circuits. And so then they can look and see what are different parts of your brain that are lighting up when you're looking at pictures of faces versus pictures of fruit. Or even pictures of faces of people you know versus people that you don't know. And even those will sometimes show different patterns of expression. So that's very similar to what we're seeing here. I'm talking about, I'll be right with you, but we'll see differences in different brain areas or even different neurons that get excited within human brains under different experiences, and we see the same kind of thing with these birds. Tyler, sorry.
Back to the human faces
thing.
What about things that look like a face, but like how sometimes you'll see a faucet and
right.
The rings look like eyes and a nose.
I follow a Twitter account called Faces in Things or something. It's awesome. It's just so much fun. But it does just that. Yeah, and I think what's happening there is that when you see something that looks a little bit like a face, sometimes it does trigger like a little facial circuit to start running. And it's this whole other interpretive center of our brain that gets going when we're looking at a visual representation of something that looks like a face. And yeah, we start to interpret facial expressions. And yeah, look up Faces in Things on Twitter. It's great. It's so good. I just love it. I think the icon is like a church steeple or something, but if you look at it, it really does. It's like this, kind of this schlumpy, facial-looking thing.
One church steeple that looks like a chicken.
These things happen. So yeah, but I think what we're doing is we're keying, like we know that's not really a face, but it keys into some of those same circuits, and we start to have similar kinds of reactions to it. So that's a really brief kind of overview of the neural basis of song learning. That work goes back into the 70s and is still ongoing today. And it continues to be a fairly major area of research that's going on right now, where people are trying to understand the neural basis of these things. We've got two more topics. I think we can at least get through one of them in our time left, because we've got about 4 minutes left. And that is to try to understand the evolutionary history of song learning. So if you go through and look at all the different groups of birds and try to do the same kind of experiment that we talked about, where you take the animal away from its typical social environment and you see, can it produce the song if it never hears the song of its own species? And you do that across all these different groups of birds. What you end up finding is that there's basically 3 major groups of birds that are capable of song learning. Those are the hummingbirds, which I think is kind of interesting. Parrots, which of course we knew parrots, right? I mean, this is in many cases the reason people seek these guys out as pets, despite, I guess in addition to being gorgeous, is that they have this ability to learn songs and learn sounds from the environment around them. And then this group that are called the Oscine songbirds, there's also these sub-Oscines. Sometimes these are called Passeriformes. If you've had any ornithology, I actually hadn't seen this term before. This is a new clarification in your book. But these are sort of like the classic songbirds. So these are sparrows, and these are warblers, and these are, you know, it's a very large group. A lot of the little small birds that buzz around here all the time are falling within that group. So what is the evolutionary history of song learning? In order to try to figure out how song learning may have evolved in this group, I think we do have to employ a phylogeny so that we can actually get a feel for what is the evolutionary history of all these groups. And so the idea is, let's first figure out how everybody's related to everybody else, and then we'll plot onto there where is song learning appearing within that phylogeny. And so here's what it ends up looking like. So this is a fairly new phylogeny. It's a bit of a revisionist phylogeny from some prior depictions. But within birds, it seems as though here are these Passeriformes, but parrots seem to be a close common ancestor, and that has nothing to do with information about song learning. That's based on, you know, molecular markers and such that are grouping them together, despite their pretty radical difference in their appearance. And then we've got sort of progressively less closely related to Passeriformes. We've got falcons, and then woodpeckers, and then owls, and gulls, and storks. And none of these guys seem to learn song. They all vocalize, but they aren't learning a song apparently. They're more just sort of producing a song no matter what what environment they're in. And then way out here we've got, you know, nestled with the swifts, we've got these hummingbirds that are sort of, you know, in this sort of unresolved group that's out here with pigeons and such. They also are able to learn song. So just looking at this, let's just sort of think this through, and this can be the last thing we do. Where do you think song learning might have evolved here? Or how many times do you think it might have evolved? Or what do you think could have happened? I mean, one argument, I'll give you 2 extremes. One argument is that song learning might have evolved 3 different times. It could have evolved in this group, and in this group, and in this group, all independently. Another argument, the other extreme, is that it may have evolved way down here in an ancestral group, and then was lost in pigeons, swifts, storks, gulls, owls, woodpeckers, falcons, but was retained in these guys and the hummingbirds. So there's 2 extremes. Do you see anything in the middle? I mean, those are both possible. Both could happen. You see another one? Yeah. I mean, maybe. I guess the argument for why it could be lost, and I guess if it's lost, then maybe it gets obliterated, is that it does require all these brain centers to be produced, which do cost energy. Brain's really expensive tissue, so if it's not serving a good purpose, if there's no advantage to it, I guess it could be lost. And maybe if it's lost, then you just lose all the genes that go with that, all the brain regions that go with that. I get your point, though. I mean, you kind of would expect some residual vestigial learning. Yeah. That would be a cool thing to look for too, right? Is try to find some genes. Your book describes the Zenk gene. Can we find that gene and see it doing anything in these non-learning groups? Did you? Yeah.
I would say that it
Wait. Here?
So, yeah, like not at the very, very bottom, so like it wouldn't be a group that leads up into
Okay.
and then it could convergently evolve in hummingbirds, but then the ancestral group goes on to produce the parrots and songbirds, but all of the others lose it.
Okay. So it could be kind of
Yeah, over there.
maybe somewhere back there. Still lost a bunch of times, but maybe it wasn't in pigeons or something. And we're out of time here, so let's pick up on this question of like, how could we reconstruct this on Thursday morning, and then we will get into the homework as that day goes on. All right, cool. Thank you. Sorry for going over.